Hi, welcome to the next section of this course, Continuous Deployment and Monitoring of Application on AWS. In this section, we start with implementation of the continuous deployment pipeline, followed by monitoring on the cloud platform. Now we move on to the first video of this section that deals with implementation of the continuous deployment pipeline. In this video, we will start with continuous deployment for a cloud-native application and understand its working. Then, we will install Jenkins to deploy the application. Earlier, we successfully set up the infrastructure, but we are yet to deploy the application. Also, we need to make sure that further deployment should be taken care of using continuous deployment. Since we have our development environment in our local machine, we don't need to set up the continuous integration cycle. However, for large-scale companies where many developers work collaboratively, we need to set up a separate pipeline for continuous integration using Jenkins. In our case, we only need continuous deployment. Our continuous deployment pipeline would be something like this. Let's see how it works. It starts with a developer pushing new code to the main branch of its version control system. In our case, it's GitHub. As soon as the new code is pushed, the Jenkins GitHub plugin detects the change as per its defined job, and triggers the Jenkins job to deploy the new code to its infrastructure. Jenkins then communicates with code deploy to trigger the code to the Amazon EC2 machine. Since we need to make sure that our deployment is successful, we can set up a notification part, which will notify us the status of deployment, so that it can revert back if needed. Next, we will look at implementation of the continuous deployment pipeline. Let's first configure our AWS service, beginning with code deploy, which will help us to deploy the application on the available app servers. Initially, when you switch to the code deploy service at this link, you should see this screen. This is the introduction page for code deploy, which showcases its capabilities. Click on the Get Started Now button in the middle of the page to move forward. Next, you should see this screen, which will recommend you to deploy a sample application, which is fine for the initial stage, but since we have already built up our infrastructure, in that case, we need to select Custom Deployment. This will skip the walkthrough. Click on Skip Walkthrough to move forward. In the next wizard screen, there are a couple of sections which need to be reviewed. The first thing it will ask you is to create application. You need to provide a user-defined application name and deployment group name, which is mandatory, as it becomes the identifier for your application. Scroll down. Here it talks about the type of deployment you want for your application. There are two methods, which are defined as shown here. Blue or green deployment. In this type, during deployment, new instances are launched and the new code is deployed to it. And if its health check is fine, it is replaced with the old one, and old instances are then terminated. This is recommended for the production environment where customers can't afford downtime. In-place deployment. In this deployment type, new code is deployed directly into the existing instances. In this deployment, each instance is taken offline for updates. We will go with in-place deployment, but the choice changes with the use case and product owner's decision. Say, for example, applications like Uber or Facebook, which can't afford a downtime at the time of deployment, will go for the blue or green deployment, which will give them high availability. Let's move on to the next part, which talks about the infrastructure where the application is going to be deployed. We will specify the instances and ELB details, as shown here. In the next segment, we will define the way to deploy the application. For example, suppose you have 10 instances. You may want to deploy the application on all these instances at one time, or one at a time, or half at a time. We will go with the default option, that is, code deploy default.one at a time. Here, we also need to specify a service role, which is needed by code deploy to perform operations on your AWS resources, more specifically on EC2 and ELB. In order to understand more about service role creation, go to the AWS documentation at this link. Once you have provided the required information, click on Create Application. You will see this screen once your application is ready. Now we are all set for deployment. All we need to create is a job in Jenkins and add a post-built part with the code deployed details. The creation of a job is similar to what we explained earlier. Some few changes are needed though. Firstly, we need to make sure we have installed a few Jenkins plugins, namely AWS Code Deploy plugin for Jenkins, Git plugin, GitHub plugin, and so on. Once you have installed the plugins, you should see new actions in the post-build actions list, as shown. Next, you need to select the Deploy an application to AWS Code Deploy action. A new section will be added, and we need to provide the details of the Code Deploy application we created in the AWS console, as shown here. This may consume time as a lot of details are required. We also need to provide access or secret keys, which we created in the previous section. This is needed as Jenkins, after packaging the application, needs to upload it to S3 and instruct Code Deploy to deploy the latest build from the specified bucket. That's all we need to do. Now our Jenkins job is ready to deploy the application. Try it out, and it should work as smooth as butter. This is all we have for this video.